Okay, it's my pleasure today to be interviewing Ben Page, who is the Gordon Scott Fulcher Professor Emeritus of Decision Making at Northwestern University. He also taught at University of Chicago, University of Texas, before he got to Northwestern, and his research interests include, among many different topics, public opinion, policy making, mass media, foreign policy, and most recently work on inequality and the influence of the very wealthy on policy making. And it's especially my pleasure to be interviewing Ben today because he and I met working on the Chicago Council survey together, a survey of Americans on foreign policy that Ben actually really started and was one of the fundamental people to start this long-standing longitudinal research work that I continue to work on today and still learn from Ben, all his writing, and also all of his guidance when I was first starting out in this role. So thank you so much for joining me today, Ben. I really appreciate your taking the time to talk with us.
Good to be here.
So just starting out, we thought we would just talk a little bit about, how you started out. I know you had a pretty interesting start in life with parents who had high aspirations for you. And why don't you tell us a little bit about growing up in Palo Alto? What about how maybe a little bit about your education, where you went to school, and what was your interest? I know that you studied a lot of different things. So, what were your key interests?
Well, I'll give you the quick version of that. I did grow up in Palo Alto. My dad taught at Stanford, taught geology. My mother created a career for herself, giving talks about foreign affairs and leading people on tours of Europe and elsewhere. And my mother and I had lively exchanges about politics. That probably got me going on the politics, and my dad probably got me going thinking uh, in more or less scientific ways. So going to school, I went to the Palo Alto schools, then I went back east to Phillips Exeter for high school, went to Stanford as a history major, um, and actually did a little poli-sci there to a master's degree, and then went back to Harvard Law School, and then back to Stanford for a PhD. So I'm one of those people who never left school for years and years.
I read a previous interview with you, and I was amazed at all the different things you've studied. Like, yeah, you went to history, and then, well, you started out as interested in biology, right? And then history and political science, and even some economics along the way. So, and you've managed to kind of pull it all together in your research.
Well, yes or no, it goes off in some different directions. But I think it's fair to say that survey research and public opinion have been at the center really of most of what I've done, including the foreign policy stuff, like the book about attitudes toward China and the book with Marshall Bhutan using Chicago Council data. Um, the main really different things aren't that different because we did a survey of the wealthy as I moved into politics of the wealthy. Um, and yeah, that's the heart of it is probably survey research. As a consumer, I have to say, I mean, it's true, as you said, that I helped out from the beginning in 1974 on the public opinion surveys by the Chicago Council, which John Riley put together. And John and I used to have interesting interchanges about what it all meant because we had both mass samples and elite samples. And I kept saying, John, it's kind of disturbing to me, especially in the wake of the Vietnam War, kind of disturbing to me that American foreign policy looks rather different from what a lot of Americans seem to want. And he said, oh, yes, that's an education problem. We have to explain to the public why it is that foreign policy is really good. And I said, isn't it possible that it's a democratic responsiveness problem? And I never really wrote about that until years later. Marshall Bhutan and I finally got together a book using Chicago Council data over the years. Fair amount of it individual behavior stuff, but the heart of it was the disconnect chapter, contrast over the years between what Americans want and what foreign policy they get. So I got the last word with John, I think.
And democratic responsiveness of government, democracy, and inequality have kind of been threads throughout your different phases of research, right?
That's right. That's right. And the democratic responsiveness thread is, of course, very closely related to the survey work, including the Rational Public Book. We were talking about the media study associated with the Rational Public Book, in which we collected TV network news contents between two surveys and predicted change in opinion between the two. And that worked surprisingly well. There was a huge inertia, as you would expect, big inertia effect. The prime predictor of survey results the second time is what they were the first time. And that helped us think about the general stability of collective opinion. A little wrinkle on it that might interest some poor people is it turned out to be really crucial to measure media content before the first survey. And we almost didn't do that until it occurred to us that if there was any tendency for effects to fade, you would want to know what had affected the first survey as that faded out, and the fading would be a predictor of what comes on the second survey, and that turned out to be absolutely true. It also turned out our exciting findings were that the sources of news were absolutely crucial. And the biggest influencers of collective opinion at that time were commentators like Walter Cronkite. Tremendous effect. One position like Cronkite seemed to be worth a percentage point or two of change in public opinion. And then supposedly nonpartisan experts had a big impact. And that led to thinking about who are these experts and who picks them and so forth. And I think that was one of the places where I began to think about the role of wealth and money in American politics and society, because pretty clearly the people we see and hear as experts often have money support from somewhere or another. And that means that people with money, to some degree, are deciding who those experts are. So that was just the media piece. Did you want some about the main opinion findings?
I do. And while we're on the topic of the media, though, I guess this was more in the Rational Public. Maybe you want to talk when we get to that point. But talking about the media environment and the role of information processing goes back to your point. When the Rational Public was written, media was much more in line, especially on international affairs, than divergent views, right? And today it's so different. So I was just curious if you could comment on that as well. But in time, absolutely, when it's comfortable for you.
We don't have to take everything perfect order, I think. And
No, we don't. We can jump around.
let's go with that thought for a minute, because Bob Shapiro and I have been talking the last few weeks about what has changed since the Rational Public. I don't know how many people believed our findings in the first place, but it's pretty clear not many believe them now. And almost everybody I talk to will say, well, good Lord, with toxic media and polarized parties and lies and confusion and so forth, how could collective opinion be sensible in the way that you were describing it? So later, maybe we can talk about our tentative findings, but the immediate point is the one you made, that was a different media world back then. And at least potentially things could be quite different. It made it a lot easier to do this kind of study, because we could randomly choose one TV network every night and be quite confident we were getting essentially what was everywhere, what the AP was sending to local newspapers, what the other networks were saying, what Time Magazine was saying, and so forth. Different world.
Well, was that the first study that you had come across, that your study with Bob, that looked at, and I know that in retrospect you might have written things differently, but that looked at changes in public opinion and how they may or may not impact changes in policy. Was your study the first to really try to draw some kind of line?
There's a research tradition, but it's hard to do. And I think the thing that we brought to it that really hadn't been done much before, two things. One is the simple design. It's sort of the opposite of the media design. Taking two full observations, basically, in which there's been a significant change in preferences. Use that as an independent variable for predicting actual policy changes. And so that's another thing our 28 research assistants spent a lot of time doing, was coding government policy, laws, executive actions, treaties, state level decisions, the whole thing. And that's where we got the old finding that Sidney Verba used to refer to as my sins of the past, which we were a little too quick to, when we found a great deal of congruence between those changes in opinion. We found that about 2/3 of the time, public policy moved in the same direction afterwards. And we made the mistake of titling our APSR article Effects of Public Opinion on Policy. I really regret the word effects. In the text, we're actually moderately careful about that. And it turns out, flashing forward to 2014 or whenever it was that Marty Gillens and I first did our work, it looks like that's mostly spurious. Maybe it's entirely spurious. We had a bivariate design. All we saw was opinion change, policy change. Whoa, maybe that's causal, but quite possibly not.
Yeah, you learn from your research, so new questions to ask and new avenues to explore.
That's the charitable reaction, but it's nice to be right the first time. Yeah.
That's true. Okay, so now let's talk about one of your other books or pieces of research of whatever you would like to talk about next.
Well, in a sense, it's a continuation of the Rational Public, because both that policy responsiveness piece and the What Moves Public Opinion article, and then a section of the Rational Public book, the media thing and the policy thing both come out of that same project. But the heart of the project really was learning the characteristics of collective policy preferences, Americans' collective policy preferences, finding out when they change, how stable they are, why they change, and whether they make any sense, and so forth. And it's kind of a big, long book that not many people have read all the way, I don't think. And one of the reasons I believe that is that a lot of people don't seem to notice our skepticism in the last chapter. So they may or may not have got there. But it is a long book, and it's got a lot of narrative in it about particular policy areas and what the trends and opinions were, so that we can address things like the supposed right turn in public opinion around 1980, which is mostly an elite phenomenon, not public. And we can address questions of what the impacts of international events are. It looks like they can be pretty big, but also overall stability or instability in opinion. And we have maybe 100 line graphs, most of which, as I was caricaturing a little earlier, are kind of, on that 0 to 100 scale, there's usually a line that might have a slow trend up, might have some wiggles in it, but it has, mathematicians would like it as being continuous and high degree of stability. And we found we're partly motivated by grappling with the old critiques of public opinion from people like Walter Lippmann, also James Madison, and Gabriel Ammon, and many, many more, who talk about collective opinion as if it's full of whims and passions, and really nobody should pay much attention. I think we convince ourselves, at least, that that was just totally mistaken.
I have to say, one of the most amazing things working on the Chicago Council data, and I think backs up completely what you're saying, is the stability of attitudes on at least just the U.S. role in general and taking part in world affairs. Going back to 1974 has been so amazingly stable, even though there have been so many changes in the way we communicate, the way we do business, globalization, everything, and yet attitudes are consistent over time, and even using different modes of research. But I think it goes something to the belief systems that Americans have about certain things, and you touch on that in the book as well.
Yes, I think that's right. That's right. And the main exception to that gradualness or stability is big international events. So that, when Pearl Harbor happens, you get big changes. And the same in a smaller way for lots of other international events. But for the most part, I think it's absolutely true in both domestic and foreign policy that there's a lot of stability. And of course, we emphasize in the Rational Public book that it's not mindless stability. That is, for example, some people seem to have the notion of that doorstop opinions given to pollsters are basically a coin flip. If that were true, you would expect survey responses to always be 50-50 and a dichotomy, or equal proportions in multiple questions. And obviously that's not the case. And so that's one piece of evidence. But also, it turns out that if you look across items, the levels of collective opinion tend to be consistent with each other on related issues. So there's not only something stable, but there's something kind of real and, as you say, rooted in beliefs and values. yeah, meaningful opinions. And in the Rational Public book, we might have got a little carried away on a couple of pages in which we used words like sensible or wise. And of course, the objective standards for such things are pretty hard to find. Um, but
In your defense, I think you were reacting to the Walter Lippmann conventional wisdom at the time. So I appreciated it, but also appreciate your ability to critique yourself and your past work. So,
well, at minimum, I think we did a reasonable job of showing that collective opinion is certainly not meaningless or whimsical. Um, and you could argue more about how often the public's right in some kind of normative sense, or principled. And those are questions that Bob and I are trying to particularly to grapple with right now in looking at what may have changed. Because if you have lots of lies and misinformation floating around in the system, you have to worry about the possibility that the whole public might be deceived about some things. So far, from what we've been able to see, there's surprisingly little of that. There's a tendency for the polarization to sort of cancel out. That is, when Republicans and Democrats go in opposite directions, the collective whole remains sort of in the middle and fairly stable.
So I'm not going to make this whole thing about foreign policy as much as I'd like to, but just wanted to you to just comment on how different American attitudes are on foreign policy versus domestic policy, and why are they different?
Well, for sure they're different. I would say the two main differences are, one, foreign policy doesn't seem close to home to most people. And so they don't care so much about it. They're not as well informed about it. They don't think it's hitting them in the pocketbook, although often it does. That's one big difference, because domestic issues, people have all sorts of signals from the grocery store and the paycheck and their friends and so forth. But another and related big difference is that in foreign policy, the officials, especially executive branch officials in the United States and everywhere else, have an awful lot of control of information. And as a youngster, I lived through various foreign policy crises that turned out later to really be quite different from what we were told by the President of the United States. One example being Lyndon Johnson talking about the Tonkin Gulf incident, which he and other officials used as a reason to escalate American involvement in Vietnam. And it turned out these unprovoked attacks may not have ever occurred, and in any case, they were provoked by espionage activities by the United States. So, control of information, that's sort of an unusual and egregious case. There are lots of other gray area cases in which probably people have been given misinformation by the government. And on many of those occasions, both political parties have gone along. Nobody, except two U.S. senators in the Vietnam case, Morse and Rooney, hardly anybody dissents. So that's a big difference.
Was your interest in control of information and how people get information, did that lead you to looking at the mass public opinion versus what you might call elite or opinion leaders surveys, and moving on to the book Foreign Policy Disconnect, did that come out of your work, looking at how Americans come to their attitudes on foreign policy and how they get their information?
Well, it's definitely connected, isn't it? um, I think our understanding of why that gap, why those big opinion gaps between elites and masses exist, has a lot to do with information. John Riley's notion that I mentioned earlier was it's just the public lacks the information. So, of course, they're not understanding what the elite experts know to be true. But as I also mentioned, the other possibility is that the elites are going astray from democratic responsiveness. And you can think of a lot of reasons that don't have to do much with information, some of which have to do with simple geopolitical power and great power ambitions and liking to run the levers of international power and so forth. Some of which have to do with the leaders not being the ones whose kids are being killed in these limited wars. And still others may have something to do with inequality of wealth and income, some kinds of policies that are just not great for ordinary people, but might be very good for big investors in stocks and bonds.
And that led you to the most recent research that you've been working on, right?
Yes, we're telescoping time because I would say, well, let's see, when was the APSA task force on democracy and inequality? That was in the early 2000s, maybe 2003 or 05. Theda Skocpol was president of it.
That was an APSA, American Political Science Association.
Yeah. Theda Skocpol was president. Larry Jacobs was kind of her head honcho at putting that together. And before that time, Larry Bartels had been almost alone in paying empirical attention to the idea of unequal responsiveness. He's done his really terrific work on the Senate, which went through many, many papers because editors wouldn't accept it and people wouldn't believe it. Larry carried on kind of a long war, which he eventually won in a big way. And I would say his work probably was the big precursor. And then this task force got it all together. By that time, Marty Gilens was collecting his amazing data set about basically contrasting affluent Americans with middle-income Americans' opinions about policies. And so Marty and Larry and a number of other people who were working in that area and myself did a big report. And political science seemed to me, I'm not sure about the causation, but after that, lots of people in political science began paying attention to unequal representation and the politics of the wealthy. I definitely did. I think the first thing along that line, and maybe you've encountered this, Dina, or maybe not, was Larry Jacobs and I used Chicago Council data to compute gaps between elites and ordinary citizens on foreign policy for the years of a bunch of different surveys. They used to be every 4 years and then became every 2. And tried to predict we used the elite surveys as kind of a rough and ready sample of actual officials, a subset of the elite interviews, and used that as a dependent variable. So, well, if the officials are more or less stating official policy when they answer these questions, at least on the average, then we could use that as a dependent variable and try to predict the attitudes of the officials by the opinions of average people and by opinions of various other groups, business people being an especially important one. There was a little too small labor leader sample, et cetera, but we media people, and we analyzed it several different ways in our APSR article, but the basic point was the average public was much less closely related to official policy than these various other elite groups, especially the business people. And so that's the work that then a little later showed up in the Foreign Policy Disconnect book as the Disconnect chapter.
And yeah, I might have jumped over some of you also wrote a book about China. Fill in any gaps that I may have.
Well, I don't think we want to try to go through everything, but China was a fairly recent project. When was that published? Maybe, I don't know, 2012 or something. And my graduate student, Shi Tao from China, got his PhD at Northwestern and worked on China policy on Capitol Hill. And he and I did a little book that used Chicago Council data and lots of other data to try to paint a picture of U.S. public attitudes toward China. Back then, they were very positive, and the main finding was people definitely wanted cooperation rather than conflict. They liked negotiating, they wanted to do business and so forth. And of course, that's another thing that's changed pretty markedly. So
go ahead. Go ahead. Finish. No, continue.
Well, that's the China book. And so the two main foreign policy books were the Foreign Policy Disconnect and the China book. The Foreign Policy Disconnect also had some stuff in it that I was very proud of, but nobody really has paid much attention to, as far as I can tell. And that is investigating belief systems at the individual level on foreign policy. And as you well know, the Council survey is regularly asked a bunch of questions about the goals of foreign policy that people favor or oppose. And there's a fairly long list. Each one, is a very important, not very important. There are threats questions. There are a whole bunch of policy questions. So we did a little causal diagram of how, at least hypothetically, fundamental goals and beliefs could come together to influence policy preferences. The R-squares were not big, but something was there. There were sort of wisps, maybe, of belief systems.
So when you think about, the really broad range of research that you have worked on, completed, are there projects that you're most proud of or feel like you have made a really significant and new contribution to, and why are you most proud of that particular item?
Well, I guess I'd have to go to the Rational Public book, because it seems to me it helps lay the foundation for really believing in democracy in the majoritarian democracy sense of believing that governments, for the most part, with certain exceptions, but for the most part, ought to pay attention to what their citizens want and usually ought to do it. And so I feel good about that. And I think that one piece of evidence about my feelings about it is that Bob Shapiro and we've already spent a fair amount of time trying to check up on whether and to what extent those same things are true. That that we found. Um, to actually do it well is going to take an enormous new study, and it's going to be much harder because of the fragmented media and the multiple polls and so forth. But then again, easier because everything's electronic. So in any event, somebody else is going to have to do that. But in the meantime, Bob and I have gathered quite a bit of data and begin to have some preliminary notions. I would say that the way things seem to be headed is that we think most of the main points of the rational public are probably still correct, surprisingly so. And that those same foundations for favoring majoritarian democracy, we think probably are still there somehow in the midst of all the toxic rhetoric and lies and fragmented media, polarized parties. Somehow or other, there's still kind of a central tendency of opinion that has a lot of good characteristics. So that would definitely be the thing I'm happiest about.
And what about work that you feel hasn't received enough attention or has been a little bit either misunderstood or neglected? You mentioned Foreign Policy Disconnect didn't get the audience you wished it had. And it's an important piece of work, so I can understand why you would prefer to elevate that since it goes to the basics of our governance.
On the other hand, there were two big barriers in trying to find an audience for that book. One is most political scientists don't care much about foreign policy. They're like most other people. And then the other problem is that a substantial part of that book is individual behavior, and nobody has ever thought of me as an expert on individual behavior. So I can't complain too much. If we did, let's see, well, we got a piece in Paul Snyderman by him that maybe somebody looked at. I'm not sure. I think if you talk to almost anybody who's written anything, you will be able to get them to admit they wish the audience had been bigger and more enthusiastic.
Well, I know that your family thinks the high point of your career, or at least your kids, was being on the Jon Stewart Daily Show. I was impressed.
Absolutely. They're quite outspoken about that. So are most of my recent students. You know, and my kids, sometimes they don't quite directly say, but they sort of think it's been downhill ever since. That was fun. Jon Stewart is somebody I admire a lot, and I was totally relaxed in dealing with him. People keep asking, had I been drinking? I mean, I looked at it very relaxed. But the fact was, he's such a humane person. I was totally confident that he wasn't going to make fun of anybody except in a general amusing way, which he did very successfully. And yeah, that was a good thing, I think. That was all about the article, of course, with Marty Gilens called Testing Theories of American Politics. And I should make very clear that Marty had been working on that data set for something like 8 or 10 years. He had an army of research assistants at UCLA, and then he continued it at Princeton, but not really much. It was mostly done by then. So when I read his Affluence and Influence book in manuscript for the University of Chicago Press, I began thinking about it. You know, this is a terrific book. I think there might be another way to package it, though. And so after the book came out, and it is a terrific book. It's a big hit. I got in touch with Marty, whom I didn't really know, and said, what would you think about doing an article together that takes roughly this form, that sort of casts things not just into questions about how much influence the public has, but talks a little about who else has influence if the public doesn't. And so we did a slightly different data analysis that involved some clever interest group data that he gathered. And that was particularly important because they turned out to be big influencers of policy, especially business groups, much more than labor or consumer groups. And so we kind of checked the triad of average people, affluent people, which of course in surveys is not very affluent, it's top 20%, and interest groups. And it turned out that, as best we could tell, average people were having almost zero impact on policy, and the affluent were doing quite well. So were the interest groups. And I think the reason we got on the Jon Stewart show was that some free thinker on the internet started talking about the Princeton study that shows there's oligarchy. It wasn't a Princeton study. We didn't use the word oligarchy, but that kind of caught on, and there was buzz all over the place, and we got phone calls for interviews and so forth. But all in a good cause, I think, because it is interesting stuff.
Yeah, so that one was not neglected. That one got a fair amount of attention, more than usual.
Oh, I wanted to make clear, I have no complaints really about reactions to anything I've written. All the books and articles that haven't been particular hits, usually they've either been obscure or not well enough done, whatever.
Well, I'm hoping the APOR members and other researchers who watch this will open up your articles and books, because they are really well written and readable, as well as super informative, and definitely central to my work. So I am definitely appreciative of all of it. I think APOR would be very interested in knowing what your thoughts are toward the field of survey research in general now. Like a lot of issues about response rates, and a lot of commentary, negative commentary about election polling, a lot of attention to that. So wondered if you could comment about some of the challenges that are facing the survey research community now, but also possibly, given your experience and mine too, of moving from face-to-face interviews to phone to internet panels, are these new challenges? Are they challenges that, we have been able to meet in past years? What strategies do you think might be successful?
Well, I have to start with a reminder that I know less about all this than almost any other member of APOR, because I'm primarily a consumer of surveys. I've designed a fair number of items to go on surveys, but actually putting a survey together, fielding it, knowing how to do interviews and so forth, I'm not expert. On the other hand, everybody can see some of these things. And I've worried about low response rates for a long time. Krosnick more or less convinced me. I'm not sure he's saying the same thing now, but he, as response rates to telephone interviews went down toward 30%, 20%, probably lower, he kept saying, well, yeah, but it looks like the samples are still fairly representative. Unfortunately, you just can't tell, because you can't measure all the ways in which they might be unrepresentative. So that's certainly been a problem. I think the internet panel idea is a brilliant idea that, and presumably you need to pay people. One of my special little concerns, being interested in the affluent and the wealthy, is getting a good sample of affluent people, because $25 or $50 it's not going to mean much to them. And I hope people are figuring out how to get that particular group in. But in principle, it seems to be possible to get a really good panel that's quite representative of the whole country and then sample from it for particular surveys. Seems to me that's progress. As far as I can tell, the personal interview has become so expensive and so difficult, and people won't even open their doors, that only the Cadillacs of the industry can do it. I guess Michigan and NORC still do a fair number of personal interviews, but they've been experimenting with other methods too. Now, one thing I do have more definite opinions about is a thing we discussed in the Rational Public book, which is that we claimed that not only did collective policy preferences have all these nice characteristics, that's policy preferences as measured by surveys, and that these opinions were real, but also measurable. And I think there are new challenges about that. When I talk to people about surveys, an alarming number say things like, oh, yeah, but they got the election predictions all wrong. And as almost all your people presumably know, that's just a gross oversimplification, because in a close presidential election, a difference of 1 percentage point in the vote can make a big difference to the outcome. But the errors in polls in 2016 and 2020 were disturbing, but they weren't very big. And of course, when it comes to my favorite kinds of poll questions about policy, there are reasons to believe that some of the inaccuracies you get on voting intentions probably don't carry over, because some people may indeed have been reluctant to say they supported Trump, to say it out loud. It's also the case that potential Trump voters were hard to identify before the survey in order to do proper weighting. And there was no way to get relevant variables to do that weighting anyway, because you'd already done the surveys and you didn't know who was going to end up voting. So, it seems to me that inaccuracy charge doesn't have much weight. And that in general, now a little note here about political scientists. Many of them study individual behavior, especially American politics people. And when they study individual behavior, they usually use the Cadillac surveys, the GSS, the ANES, and so forth, with a few exceptions. And they usually are thinking about individual behavior, not collective behavior. And in fact, those surveys aren't very good at getting at detailed policy preferences, because they were largely designed with sort of an attitudinal model in mind that most people don't have much in the way of opinions. Let's make it easy to say don't know. Let's filter out everybody who hasn't heard or read about things, so forth and so forth. So, am I losing my thread here? Possibly. I think the where I was headed was that a lot of these individual behavior political scientists just don't follow commercial and media polls. They don't pay a lot of attention to collective opinion. And I see you nodding, Dina. I think that's quite possibly true even for Chicago Council surveys, which are really well done and very always interesting, as far as I can say. A lot of political scientists don't pay attention, but I think there are still very good reasons to pay attention to them, and I have a lot of admiration for the day-to-day survey research people who design those and carry them out, sometimes with short time frames and these difficult sampling problems and getting those interviews done.
So thinking about your contributions and your findings, what do you hope future scholars will take from your data and take from your writings and advance? What kinds of either theories or investigations or analyses would you love to see others carry forward?
Well, I think two main areas. One, I mentioned, we could use a really big systematic study or maybe a series of smaller studies following up on what the rational public looks like now, because it does seem to me that's really important to democracy. And when you have so many people challenging the very idea of democracy, it is especially important to find out whether it is still true that public opinion makes a good foundation for government. The other area where I would hope to see research has to do with the wealthy, because Marty Gilens made enormous progress studying the affluent. But as I say, and Larry Bartels too, I would say studied the affluent, because Larry's top third of income earners weren't very wealthy, and Marty Gilens' top 20%, somewhat more so, but when you look at the actual income statistics of the time, they're not really wealthy at all. The top 1% is quite a different world, and the top 1/10 of 1% is quite different from that. And then astoundingly, billionaires are, the top 1%. What's my number here? Well, a billionaire has about 1,000 times the wealth of a 1%er on the average. 1,000 times. So if political power is at all related to wealth, then first of all, if it were linear, Jeff Winters and I explored that idea just kind of as an exercise. It's clear that the billionaires would have a lot of influence on what goes on, but how on earth do you find out? So that's a big research area for me. And maybe it just takes you back to historians and archival work and case studies. You can't do a Marty Gilens kind of study. The N is too small. You can't get the data. You can't find out what these billionaires think or what kinds of policies they want.
This has been really fun to do this survey of your work with you. There's the end of the questions I kind of prepared. Is there anything else you wanted to add or leave future viewers with?
I forgot to mention one thing that kind of helps explain the segue in my work between the rational public and the wealthy. And that was our little survey of Chicago area wealthy, which NORC did, and with remarkable skill and tenacity. It's extremely difficult to sample the really wealthy. And, they have multiple homes. They don't want to be interviewed. But sampling alone is hard, just finding out who they are, and then they don't want to be interviewed, and they have gatekeepers and so forth. So the NORC people, especially Kathy Haggerty, I would say, did a marvelous job of figuring out how to get a good sample. And we actually did get a good sample of the top 1%. I think it's still probably the best around on really wealthy people, and asked some pretty good policy questions. So that was a very satisfying piece of work. And Larry Bartels worked on it, J.C. Wright, a bunch of Northwestern people, Christopher James, and so forth. And that led, thanks to Jason C. Wright, led to our research on billionaires. We did a Northwestern book with Jay and me and grad student Matt Lacombe that cleverly, thanks to Jay, used internet information to get as best we could at the opinions of billionaires. And our number one finding, which surprised us but shouldn't have, was that you can't find out. They haven't said anything about most issues, except for an atypical handful like Bloomberg and so forth, Soros, and two or three others. But most of them, over a 20-year period or so, said absolutely nothing about Social Security or taxes or foreign policy or anything else. So we had fun writing the little book about billionaires and stealth politics, but it is a call for more research in a very big way, because we weren't able to find out how influential they are or precisely what they want. So this has been enjoyable.
I'm so glad. It would be hard to know what kind of incentive you'd have to give a billionaire to participate in an in-depth interview.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that additional thought. And yeah, it has been very fun to catch up. I'm going to end the official part, stop recording. Thank you, Ben Page, for all your contributions.
Thank you.